Hello, my name is Michael Green, and I am professor at the University of Lodz. I welcome you to the third episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation. Today my guest is Elizabeth Tingle, who is professor at the University of Montfort in England. Her research focuses on the early modern period, Reformation, Counter Reformation, and her current research project is about cathedrals and collegiate churches in early modern Europe, as well as their role in urban culture and economy. In my podcast today, we'll be discussing how Professor Tingle made her choice to become a historian. How did she become a student at the University of Oxford, and what motivated her to continue her academic career and eventually become professor of history. So I welcome Professor Tingle to my podcast, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome to my podcast, Historians in Conversation. And today we will be talking about your path as an historian.
Hello, Mikhail. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to talk with you about the subject of history.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to ask you, where do you come from? Could you tell a little bit about your background? Where were you born?
I was born in 1962, although you probably don't need that information, in the UK city of Leicester. And I was the first child in a family of three. And my father was a low-ranking police officer, and my mother was a housewife, as we called them in those days, a homemaker, as we call them today. So I came from quite a humble background. There were three children and two grown-ups living in a small house. And I grew up then just outside of the city of Leicester in a smallish town, really, on the edge of Leicester, went to state schools and then ultimately to university. So that was my pathway.
And I saw in your CV that you went to quite prestigious universities. Could you tell a little bit, first of all, maybe why did you choose to study history? And did you have any interest in history before going to the university? And then maybe how did you get to those prestigious places?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So when I was a little girl, when I was 5, 6 or 7, I loved reading. And I particularly liked reading myths and legends and fairy stories. And like a lot of people, I grew to love history through reading myth, particularly the myths of the ancient Greek and Egyptian worlds. And the book that was probably most influential on my childhood was Robert Graves's Myths of Ancient Greece. It was a children's book of sort of myths for children written by Robert Graves. And I borrowed it from our local library and I read it and reread it and reread it. I had it out for a year. I kept renewing it and renewing it. And then from there, I went on to read about the ancient world and archaeology and excavations and medieval history and all sorts of things for children, and then carried on reading as I became a teenager. And I had just developed an absolute love of history. And when I was a teenager, I had the opportunity, when I was 16, to work on a big excavation of a Roman villa in the city of Leicester that was just uncovered. It was called Norfolk Street. And it was probably the residence of a noble or the governor of the city just outside the city walls. It had wall paintings, it had mosaics, it had all the bells and whistles of a high status Roman house. And I worked there for a whole summer and then again through the year a little bit. And that just made my interest in history and archaeology grow. So I would say that I sort of grew up with a love of history through reading, through doing these things. I loved going to museums and looking at objects. I was clearly a boring child, but history was my great love. And so that's what I wanted to go on and do. And this caused some conflict with my parents because, and a lot of people will recognize this, my father, first of all, it was unusual in my circumstances for a girl to go to university in the late 1970s. And my father thought, well, if I was clever enough to go to university, I should do medicine or law. But I didn't want to do medicine or law. I looked at it and I didn't have a vocation to do medicine or law. And so I wanted to do history. And I wanted to do archaeology, but we had a big argument about that and I settled for history instead. So that's how I came up to my love of history. It was through that personal interest and reading. And then I suppose I was lucky enough. When I went to state schools, they were not high achieving schools. I came from quite a working class district, and then went on to an experimental secondary school where there was no streaming according to ability, where students were in mixed ability classrooms. And to be honest, it was quite Darwinist in the way it was. There was often no discipline in the classrooms. You sort of had to claw your way up if there was going to be any achievement. It was something Leicestershire was known for in the 1970s. But I was lucky. I was quite a clever girl. I was a sort of typical sort of girly, like to read and do well in my studies. And I did well at exams. And it was through that route that I got to do A-levels, as we call them, the sort of senior qualification in the UK. And I had a very good history teacher who encouraged me to apply to high status universities. So that's how I got there, really, through good teaching, through hard work, and through judicious selection of the place to go.
So how did you decide to try to go to London? Because Leicester and London, well, it's not that close, I think.
It's quite close. We're joined by the M1, the main motorway in the UK. It goes from Leicester, actually goes from London to Sheffield and then on to Leeds, and it passes Leicester. And there's a direct train line into St Pancras, very handy for going to France these days. You just have to cross the concourse and you're on the Eurostar. And UCL is actually where I went. University College London is quite close to there. Now, the reason I went to University College London was twofold. Firstly, I didn't want to go to Oxford or Cambridge. I wanted to go to the big city for the adventure. And secondly, my best friend's brother was at University College London, and he was quite a raffish individual. And when I went down to look round, he showed me round, and I thought, oh, this is enormous fun. Because he showed me all the interesting bits, shall we say. So I applied to UCL. And in those days, the selection process was quite rigorous. They required low entry grades because they decided in advance who they wanted. And they decided in advance who they wanted by looking at predicted grades of students, and mine were fortunately quite good. They then asked for written work, and my teacher sent them one of the essays that I'd written, and then there was an interview. So the selection process was quite rigorous in those days. And then after that, I was offered a place, which I took up at UCL. So it took a little bit of getting into, and that's how I ended up there. And I did 3 years at UCL, which was excellent, very good training, all the facilities of London. And while I was there, I decided I wanted to do a PhD. I would like to take my history further. And as a child, I wanted to be a teacher, a history teacher. And I still thought I wanted to work in education, possibly in higher education. So I did a PhD. And because I got a good degree grade, I got a first class degree. In those days, I was able to apply for a grant, a state scholarship. And I already had quite a lot of a state scholarship because I came from a relatively poor background to do my studies at UCL. And I got a state scholarship to do a PhD at Oxford. It wasn't Oxford funded, it was funded by the Economic and Social Sciences Research Council. And because I got the grant, then it was relatively easy in those days to get a place in Oxford because I was funded externally. And I went to study, I worked on the French building industries, economic and social history in the 1980s, with Robin Briggs, the French historian based at All Souls. So that was my trajectory into history and into universities.
I think that, some of your story definitely echoed with me personally because I also love to read. And for me, it was the French books that drove me to like history, Dumas in particular. So I could really relate. And I think it's also interesting that you were not afraid to leave Leicester was not a very small town, but it's not as big as London. But still leaving family and everything behind and move. I think it was pretty brave. And how did you select your supervisor? How was it back in the day of, how did the PhD function? Was it similar to nowadays that you apply to a certain professor, you write an email and... You either get in good contact or not?
It was exactly that. When I was thinking of, I decided to work on French history, largely because of my languages. My languages weren't very, I didn't have very many languages. I'm not like you, Mikhail. I don't speak many languages fluently. I have French.
Your French is much better than mine.
And
There's
now
no
I have
doubt
Spanish.
about it.
But when I was doing my degree, half of my degree studies were in Russian history. And I had a great interest in Russian history of the 19th and 20th centuries and before that. And I particularly loved reading Russian literature. Turgenev was a particular favorite of mine. And I did think, should I go on to study Russian history? But I thought, well, I don't have any Russian. It will probably take me a while to learn Russian. But I do have some French. And I'm quite interested in those days, social and economic history was very popular. And I had already I was part of a project team doing archaeological work in Brittany in France. And when I was an undergraduate, one of my tutors, Wendy Davis, who is a very eminent medievalist, and she and a very eminent archaeologist called Grenville Astle ran a 5-year project called the East Brittany Survey, looking at a part of Eastern Brittany, looking at its history, its archaeology, and how the landscape use and the history of a particular rural region changed over time. And there was good documentary evidence for that region right from the 8th century. There were lots of charters in the Abbaye de Redon. And I worked on that project, first of all, as a sort of a seasoned archaeologist, doing field work. And then I worked on the project as a research assistant. After I graduated, I took a year between my degree and my PhD to work for Wendy Davis. I did some pottery analysis. I did some data analysis. I worked on that project. And because of that, I thought, A, I'd like to work on Brittany because I know it. And B, I'd like to work on French history because I have the language. And I'm actually increasingly interested in that period, that place. And there was a lot of work in Brittany on medieval Brittany and quite a lot on modern Brittany. So I thought I'd do some work on early modern Brittany and that I'd like to work on some aspect of material culture or something similar. So I worked on the building industries and it was a socio-economic study of the building industries, but I also went out and looked at buildings as well. So that's how I came to French history. And I spent the year, as well as working as a research assistant, working on excavations in France run by French teams. Often I was the only English speaker there, so I was forced to learn and speak French very quickly. And that really upped my game for the start of my PhD. So I improved my language. I developed a liking for French history. It's all rather a mishmash of reasons, really. But then I started my PhD at Oxford with Robin Briggs. I spent a year in Oxford, and then I went to France for a whole year and worked in the archives for a whole year. And then I came back, and then I was to and fro Oxford and France. And then I wrote up my PhD. I finished in just over 3 years.
That's pretty fast. And was your PhD published right away?
I published it as articles rather than as a book. No. And there were reasons for that. And that was partly because I didn't think it would make a very good book. And secondly, because I decided at the end of my PhD to go into school teaching. And after my PhD, I trained to be a school teacher. I trained in history and French as the two subjects that I would teach. And then I went to teach in a school. It was a sixth form college, so older students for a year, and then decided that I would actually try to get into universities.
I wonder, how did your study in Oxford go? Could you tell us a little bit more how the study was built and also about social life? How was it to be a PhD student back in the day in Oxford?
Well, in the 1980s, PhD students often lived in separate colleges, and I was at Wolfson College, which was basically just a dormitory for PhD students who were often supervised in other colleges. And so my supervisor was at All Souls, which didn't take students. It was only a staff college. And therefore, I sort of resided in one place and was supervised in another. And in those days, supervision was very what I would call low-key. I had a meeting with my supervisor once every 4 to 6 weeks, and that was it.
But it's still pretty regular, I must say, because in some cases, I've heard of cases where people met their supervisors twice in their whole PhD. So it's...
Yes, well, in my second year, I had 2 letters from my supervisor, and that was it, because I was in France for the whole year. And so I used the facilities at Oxford for my study weren't brilliant. The Bodleian Library had some sources, but not very many. And these were in the days before digital sources. Wasn't anything digitized in those days. And so I actually spent quite a lot of time in London working at the British Library, because the holdings there were much richer for me than they were in Oxford. So I did tend to move about. I wasn't a student that was immersed in the social life and culture of Oxford. I did go to some of the seminars there. I did an excellent course with Richard Smith at All Souls on statistics and computing, early computing and statistics, and I loved it. And we did a whole term course once a week. It was a 12-week course. And that really, really set me up for doing statistical work and working on sort of relatively early computing databases like SPSS. That was good. And then I spent my second year entirely overseas, and I just left the UK in September, and I didn't come back until the following summer. In fact, it was after the summer. I didn't return until the autumn, because I worked in I worked in archives in Rennes for 6 months, in Brittany, in Nantes for 2 or 3 months, and then in Vannes for 2 or 3 months. And then I worked in 1 or 2 other places, and then I came back. And then when I came back, I made a bit more of an effort in Oxford to sort of have more of a sort of social life. And I joined the Archaeology Society, and I became president of the Oxford Archaeological Society. They have a sort of rolling presidency of 1 term, where the person who's president sets up the weekly talks, which are held in the Ashmolean Museum, entertains the speakers, etc. And I met some such wonderful and interesting people in the Archaeology Society. We used to go out on field trips. We used to go around the sort of medieval sites of Oxfordshire in minibuses, and meeting speakers and doing voluntary work and just sort of some social activities with the people there. So that was nice in my 3rd year, getting to know the people interested in archaeology and finishing off my PhD. So again, my supervision was fairly minimal. My supervisor read 1 draft of every chapter, and that was it. And then I submitted. And I was lucky to get through my viva, really, because I wasn't at all prepared. And my thesis had some technical weaknesses in it, but it passed. And then I went on to do other things effectively. So that was my Oxford experience. It was a bit sort of in and out of Oxford, but the Archaeological Society, they were a great group of people, and I very much enjoyed working with them and meeting them.
And they were ready to accept an historian as their president.
Oh, yes. Well, actually, the president after me was a physicist. It was very mixed. He was doing a PhD in nuclear physics.
Well, I think that for many people, this PhD time can be a very lonely time, because they're very occupied with writing and producing, and there is quite a big difference from what I know between different countries and the way that those theses are written. For example, in the Netherlands, we had to write a book that was meant to be published, and some people even defended already a published book. I didn't dare, because I thought that it would be too dangerous. What happens if I'm heavily criticized at the defense, and then I cannot change anything anymore? But others published already before the PhD, and Germans have to publish their PhD to have their degree confirmed. So it's pretty interesting, all those differences. And I wonder, do you think that Oxford gave you some kind of privilege as in the job field later, and maybe also as an historian? Do you think that if you did your PhD somewhere else, it would have been different career paths or different quality?
I think it gave me a small privilege in that when I went for a job at Northampton University, it wasn't called Northampton University in those days. I think having an Oxford PhD gave me an entree. But actually, after that, I did go into teaching, first of all. So I went to the Institute of Education. I went back to London for that. I trained to be a teacher in London. And then I went out to Essex, to Colchester, for my first job. When I was there, I thought, actually, I think I'd probably like to work in higher education, with no guarantee of getting a job. And I applied for a 1-year role at Northampton. And I think the entry into that, having an Oxford PhD, was useful. Thereafter, I don't think it was particularly any more useful than any of the other things that I did. And I think actually experience and publications, once you had that initial, that 1-year contract was made permanent at the end of the 1 year. And it wasn't made permanent because I got an Oxford job. It was made permanent because I was competent. And then once I'd had that experience and I'd published, that becomes more important, I think. And I was at Northampton for 16 years. I was there a long time before moving on to Plymouth. And I think because I made my career in what we call the post-1992 universities, the new universities, and not the ancient universities, I think they are more meritocratic. There is more meritocracy there. And I think people look at the topics you studied, what you've published, and your experience much more than they look at who supervised you and where you came from. And so I've been fortunate in that as a child of the working classes, that I've preferred to work in those more public sector universities. They're all public sector, but they are more particularly a particular type of university. And I think they are more open to background and to experience than perhaps some other places.
And you mentioned that you came back to higher education because you first had a teaching job. And what actually motivated you to leave school and to go into higher education, well, back to higher education?
Well, I enjoyed the teaching job. The people at Colchester Sixth Form College were tremendous colleagues, very professional. But what I missed was the research and the ability to, what we might call, create new knowledge, to look at ideas, to look at new areas of knowledge, and to write. And I decided at that point, actually, I wanted to do these things. So I'd look to go back into higher education. But I knew that I probably wouldn't be able to get a job because of my background, the topics and my experience. I probably wouldn't be able to get a job in a prestigious university. I needed to get a job in a university where teaching, as much as research, was important. And so I applied to Northampton. I saw this 1-year post, and they wanted someone with teaching experience to help teach on the teacher education degree, as well as the history degree, which they had newly developed there. And I had both of these backgrounds, both the teacher education background and the history background. And so I got a job that was slightly unconventional. And that's how I went back into higher education.
And you stayed in Plymouth afterwards for 16 years. That's where we met, back in 2009.
It was indeed. I was at Northampton for 16 years, and then I moved to Plymouth, and I was there for 10 years. And we met in 2009 in Plymouth. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, it's been 13 years.
I loved Plymouth. I loved being at Plymouth University. The team there were great. It was a lovely city. The students were really lovely too. But after 10 years, I'd had enough. And I wanted, because Plymouth's a long way away. It's a long way west. It takes a long way to get into central England. And my children had grown up and moved to university in central England. And I thought it was time to go back into the centre of England. And so moved to Montfort University.
And from a job perspective, we have heard recently a lot of discussion about discrimination of women and wrong attitude towards women also in academia. And I wonder if you experienced anything like that you could share. Perhaps there are some things that you would not want to, but is it something that you have encountered? Because I've heard in my own surroundings quite a few stories about it in different places. And I wonder just how common it was.
It was more common than it is now. Thank goodness, because I think when I was starting out, I think there was one of the questions I was asked at my interview at Northampton, which made my colleagues, my history colleagues on the panel blush, was, what will your husband do if you move to Northampton? Now, that, of course, was against equal opportunities law. So, I mean, they shouldn't have been asking me that sort of question, but the external on the panel asked that question. And therefore, and I said, well, he will shift for himself, using Thomas More's famous words there. But there was this view that perhaps I wasn't a serious candidate because, I had a household to consider. That was not the attitude in the department, which was wonderful at Northampton. It was a department that was very open and equal. But I think where I found most issues were when I had my children. And so having maternity leave and returning to work is the most difficult thing, it was difficult for younger women, because not only had they had the time away from the career and from writing, but often, and this happened to me, it was regarded as time off, when you could have been doing writing. And when I came back after my second child, I asked for a sabbatical so that I could catch up on my research. And I was told by the research lead, well, you've already had a year off. No, you have a sabbatical. And I've heard that story a lot of times from women who've taken time out to have children. And so that what we might call not overt, but indirect discrimination, I think is still out there, actually. People go away for 9 months because they're having their children. There is a move against it. Things are better now. People are more aware. But I do think that still happens sometimes in some places. And I think it would be wrong to say that it doesn't. And I have to say that young women who perhaps lack confidence and perhaps don't have a sense of their own worth have a much more difficult time than older women like myself. And of course, I became head of history, I became head of humanities, I've been an associate and I've been a deputy dean and all of these things, and sort of grown in confidence as I've got older. And I expect people to listen to me when I speak, and I speak with authority and expect people to ask if I'm in a particular situation. I can do that because I'm older, and people have a different attitude to older women than they do younger women. And I think younger women do have a problem sometimes imposing we might call their authority and their expertise. And I have had to go into classrooms in higher education, for instance, where the students are being very naughty with young female colleagues, and I've had to tell the classes off. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But it's true. And that wouldn't have happened if it was a male tutor taking those. And so you can see the teacherliness coming out in me now, going into a classroom of 21-year-olds and giving them a stern telling off for the way in which they are behaving and expecting them to behave better, which generally they have done, to be honest. But yes, there are all sorts of little issues, I think, that affect women in higher education that we may not see on the surface.
Well, I think that the idea of authority that one should have also at a young age is also relevant to some extent for men, because if you lack it, then in the classroom, the students will not let you be.
No, I agree with that. And I have seen issues with male tutors as well, but more often with female.
Yeah.
And we know that when students give feedback on teaching, they give males better feedback than they do females. And I think this sense of authority is at the heart of that.
Can I ask you a personal question? Well, I know you for quite a few years, as we said, yes. 13. And you have a very rich career. You've been on many positions, also positions of power. But I also know you as a very helping and very open person. And I wonder, how do you manage to maintain this quality, this openness, because we talk about, I think, rather private things in public. And I know you're the person who's always willing to help. How do you manage to keep this side of yourself versus this authoritative side that is, of course, there?
Well, I think the most important thing one always has to remember is that, do unto others, and that we are all equal souls before the Almighty, whoever we are, whatever creed, colour, race, background, social status, wealth. And that really is really, really important to me, so that all human beings should be treated with equal dignity and given time. And that's always been a really important aspect of my life, really. So when people want to talk about particular things or need advice or help, I may not be able to help, but I'll certainly listen and do my best, because I just think one has a duty, possibly. That's not the right word, but to treat all people as equal. There is a wonderful line from the Putney debates, which would took place in the English Civil War. So the least he is as important as the greatest he, said one of the radical speakers. And I always have that in mind, John, and I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, I think that that's a very important quality, especially when you are teaching at the university and interacting with students or younger colleagues. And sometimes this support is something that makes a person either go or quit.
I think that's absolutely right. And I also do a lot of public engagement work. So I do a lot of work with the general public. I help run a lot of societies, usually history or archaeology or heritage type societies, and that is actually a great leveler, because people will speak to you on an equal basis. They don't know who you are, and it makes one learn humility, to be told things that perhaps one doesn't wish to hear, but has to hear them with grace anyway. And I am a great believer that one deals with the outward world with grace, because otherwise, I just think that's just a really important thing for other people to see. If we're thinking about fashioning ourselves in the outside world, then I think some humility and grace is a very important qualities. We need to listen. We're not right all the time, and everyone has an opinion, whether it's right or wrong. We need to listen to it. And if it is wrong, or if it's challenging, or if it's racist or sexist or whatever, then we need to push back against that. But we can do that best if we treat it with grace, and we don't get cross and we don't get angry. But we still need to do that.
I totally agree with this approach, and I will try also to adopt it. And
we don't always succeed, but it can be an aspiration.
It's certainly an inspiration, and I think for me it is inspiring to talk to people who are successful in what they're doing, and also see how they deal with not only successes but difficulties. And that's also a point that I wanted to ask you. Is there anything that you could tell about difficulties that you've faced? I don't know, in publications, if it was maybe difficult to publish, or job applications that were maybe not always successful. Because it's something that I think nowadays young researchers and young scholars encounter a lot, because the job market is getting narrower and narrower, and at times it's a problem that is difficult to deal with. And the competition for publication becomes greater and greater. Also, the journals become stricter and stricter. And I hear quite often from younger colleagues that their articles get rejected, and it really puts them down. So, yeah.
So I think with publications, everyone gets rejected sometimes. And I think what you have to do is read what the peer reviewers say and take it to heart. Now, sometimes they can be contradictory, but there's usually some kernel of usefulness in there. And so you can use what they say to try and improve your work. I think getting other people to read work is important as well, circulating it around peers, getting comments back, etc. So I think as much feedback as possible when producing a piece of work. And I think don't get disheartened. So if a piece is rejected, take the advice on board, turn it round, send it somewhere else. And this will happen. It will happen. It happens to all of us. The same with job applications. I think take the feedback that's given and then move on. But I also think, and I've been thinking this for some time, that many people who do PhDs in our subject, in history, could usefully be looking for jobs outside of academia as well, because actually outside of academia, there are lots of really quite interesting jobs in heritage, in museums, we need good school teachers. The average life of a school teacher is 4 years at the moment after training, because it's hard work. But we need people with resilience. There needs to be more support for new teachers, but we need more people with skill, resilience, because the younger age group as well as the older age group need really good teaching and guidance for their future careers. And so there is a whole world. I would say think about the whole world if you're thinking about jobs as well as jobs. Press on, but look elsewhere as well. Don't just keep your quiver in one, arrows in one quiver. Look around. I actually think the most difficulties come from interpersonal relationships. Having sort of been in and around universities for a long time, I think if you're in a particular position of management or authority, I think interpersonal relationships can be difficult, and I think navigating those is always difficult for everyone. And whether you are in a leadership position or not, interpersonal relationships are something that always have to be navigated. And when I first became head of school at Plymouth, I was given, very briefly, I was sent for sort of leadership mentoring with somebody who used to be a Marine, because Plymouth was a great military base and he was an ex-Marine. And so I said to my mentor, we had some coffee and some donuts, and I said, "So what is the secret to dealing with difficult people?" I said. And he looked at me and he went, "Well," and I said, "You're just going to tell me you have to be brave and get on with it, aren't you?" And he said, "Well, yes, that is the nub of it, really." That was the last meeting I had. I decided if that was all he was going to tell me then, but actually that's entirely true. You have to take a deep breath and you have to speak frankly, but not rudely, and talk about things and have them out, really. I think that's the only way in which conversation and dialogue is really, really important. And in a way, the articles, the jobs, the relationships, that constructive dialogue is what you need to be doing, whether it's with feedback on your article, whether it's feedback on jobs, whether it's dealing with other people. Constructive dialogue is always the way forward with any difficulty, I think.
Thank you. I was thinking while we were talking about being at this, the last part in this managerial position at the university, head of school, right? That you are also a mother at the same time, and back then your children, I think they were quite young. How did you manage to do both jobs? And that's of course brings us back to the question that you were asked by your interviewer, and you succeeded. And I think it's important to show that it is possible.
It is.
But of course, we are not operating in vacuum, and there is some environment that is supporting us, either if we write or if we work in any other position. But since research takes a lot of effort and teaching also takes a lot of preparation, managing on top of this, I just wonder if you could perhaps tell, how did you navigate between those things?
Well, I'm very lucky. I have a splendid husband. And we have always shared the domestic duties between us, childcare, cooking, the rest of it. I have to admit, when my children were very young, I had help. So I had a day help come in to help me, and who would look after the children, help with some of the domestic chores. And then when they went to school, I had a mother's help who used to come in the afternoon for 3 hours, would meet them from school and look after them until we got home. And as they grow up, it gets easier. So I had my husband has been a rock, and we had some help. And 4 years ago, my husband became very ill. He got cancer. And I decided at that point, my children were grown up then, they were at university, just leaving university. I was head of school at De Montfort, but I decided at that point it was time to take a step back from that and spend more time at home. So I went down for being head of school. I was very lucky. De Montfort made a post for me in the history department as professor of history. I went to 0.5 half time so I could spend more time at home. And mercifully, with excellent treatment at the hospital, he recovered from that cancer. He's been in bad health on and off since then, so the 0.5 has been very, very helpful. So I think teamwork, isn't it? That's again the answer. It's teamwork. You need support. I became a grandmother at the weekend.
Wow, congratulations.
Also had her first baby, so I'm actually going over to see them every other day at the moment. Fortunately, it's the vacation. So yes, family is always important as a support, and at particular points of life, it has to take over. It has to take, because family is the most important thing of all.
And that's, I think, also a very good example for our listeners that it is possible to have a family, be active researcher, and of course, if you have help from your partner, in this case, it's easier. And maybe last question, well, maybe one before last. How does your family see you? Because
how does the family see me?
Yeah.
They see me as slightly insane, I think. They think I work too hard. My husband thinks I'm a workaholic. He's probably right, to be honest. And I always think my children, when they were little, were quite glad to be out with their childminder for sort of ice creams and jigsaws, because if they were with their mother, they tended to have to read more or learn verbs and things like that. Not, but we've always got on very well. I have my son living with me at the moment, actually, because he went traveling and then came back without a house, and he and his partner, they're going to move out next week. But we've always got on very well. We see the family as a team, and I think that's really, really important. And so we support each other.
This is actually a very interesting point, to see family as a team.
Yeah,
it's a very valid point, I must say. And
yes.
We always finish those podcasts with some motivation idea, how people who are interested in history, either students who are considering continuing to do their masters or PhDs, or younger researchers who are in between careers, or those who just finished the PhD and thinking what to do. What could you tell them? It's not really an advice, but what would be the message that you could give them?
Well, I think if people are thinking about a career in history, or indeed carrying on as an interested amateur in history, I think take opportunity of all the wonderful things that are out there in the community. Because while you said earlier that history can be a lonely career, especially as a PhD student, but if a person joins societies and goes to activities with other people, goes to museums and takes the activities there, go traveling with friends and have or family, and see different places, because place, of course, is also very historic. I think try history as a social activity as well as an academic activity. And if you enjoy it on that basis, then history's for you. If you think about it as just a study and career, then it can be. You can go into teaching, but will you really enjoy it? Will you be able to stay the course? Whereas if behind you, you're a member of some groups that have a common interest in history, you go out and do social activities, seeing things, enjoying traveling, I think that will sustain you in your studies, and also perhaps give you an interest in a particular area. It will open up the whole history to you. And what we tend to see with researchers, and this is natural, we focus down on quite small subject areas, when actually there's a lot of history. The whole world and all peoples and all times have history, and it's really interesting and captivating. So as well as the particular area, try to think more widely, trying to think of history as a common endeavour of humanity, and that will make it more enjoyable. It's got to be enjoyable for you to stay the course.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this fascinating conversation. And I wish you a lot of luck and a lot of success, and hope to talk to you soon again.
Indeed, indeed. Take care of yourself. It's been a pleasure. Bye, Michael.
Thank you.